somewhere in Mali, where the sand folds in waves and the heat moves like a whisper, there once was a city of books. Not a library in the way we imagine now, not glass doors and neon lights. No scanners, no carpets, just old rooms, stone walls, wooden trunks. And inside those trunks were thousands of pages, manuscripts, handwritten, bound in leather, stored on shelves carved by hand, guarded by the wind. It's easy to forget what books once were. They weren't printed by the thousands. They weren't disposable. They were precious. They were copied, one word at a time. And in Timbuktu, yes, that Timbuktu, a treasure of knowledge grew quietly for centuries. Astronomy, law, philosophy, poetry, things we thought came later, had already been written down and hidden in the desert. But this isn't a story about the past. It's about a man who saw that past slipping away and decided not to let it. His name was Abdelkader Haidara. Not a soldier, not a revolutionary, just a librarian. And when militants began to sweep across Mali in 2012, when fires were lit and books were called forbidden, Abdel did something quiet, something unarmed, something that took no speeches and no permission. He began to smuggle the books. Not just one, not a box, but over 350,000 manuscripts. He packed them in metal trunks. He loaded them onto donkey carts, sometimes a canoe. He hid them beneath sacks of rice. He drove past checkpoints. He walked in silence through the heat, and he told almost no one. He didn't do it for money. He didn't do it for recognition. He did it because he believed something we forget far too often, that a story, once gone, is gone. If you were to meet him, you'd find a man who smiles slowly. He speaks carefully, with long pauses. He touches the books like they're alive, and maybe they are, because each one carried something, a memory, a belief, a lesson, a question. Tonight, we'll follow him. We'll walk the narrow alleys of Timbuktu. We'll sit in the dark rooms where he first learned to read. We'll watch the city fall silent, and then we'll move with him slowly, carefully through the desert. You don't need to follow closely. You don't need to stay awake. Just rest here. I'll keep the story going. You stay warm. Before he was a guardian, before the desert whispered secrets to him, Abdelkader Haidara was just a boy, a quiet boy, in a city older than most of the world remembers. He grew up in Timbuktu, a place that had once been called the City of Scholars. In the 1400s, it had rivaled the great learning centers of the world. Its scholars debated astronomy and theology under lantern light. Books were copied by hand, and people traveled from far across the Sahara to study there. By the time Abdel was born, in 1965, that golden era had long passed. But the books, they remained. His family kept them. They were custodians of one of the largest private manuscript collections in Mali. Generations before him had protected the pages, not in vaults, but in wooden trunks wrapped in cloth, tucked into rooms where dust could settle but not harm. Abdel wasn't told to love the books. No one forced him to read them. They were just always there. And maybe that's how real love begins. He would sit on the floor and traced the edges of the pages with his fingers. The ink had faded, but it hadn't disappeared. You could still read verses written 700 years ago in Arabic, Songhai, Fulani. Some manuscripts were about ethics, some about agriculture. Others explained how to navigate the stars or settle disputes in marriage. There were no illustrations, no colorful covers, but they were alive, and Abdel could feel it. He once said that the manuscripts taught him how to think, not what to think, but how. They sat quietly, night after night, whispering things to him in the still air of Timbuktu, not in loud proclamations, but in slow, deliberate phrases. At school, he was a good student, but it was at home, in that warm, dusty room, where he truly learned. The smell of old leather, the way the light hit the spines of books stacked too high, the feeling of sitting with something older than anyone he knew. He didn't know, back then, that he would be asked to protect them. No one told him that a time would come when he'd be loading them into carts and praying they made it through the next checkpoint. He just knew they mattered. In his teens, he began helping his father catalog the family's collection. Not on a computer, there were none, just handwritten lists, notes in margins, cross-references in old journals. Some books were cataloged by smell, some by the color of thread used to bind the spine. And the older they were, the softer they became, like silk folded too many times. When Abdel turned 17, his father passed away. Suddenly, the books were his. A weight settled on his shoulders. Not heavy, not painful, but quiet, like something ancient had chosen him. He could have gone elsewhere, taken a different life. There were cities with paved streets, offices with fans that hummed all day. But he stayed. He studied Islamic law. He read the manuscripts again, this time as a man. And he began to realize that these books didn't belong only to him. They belonged to Mali, to Africa, to the world. They were evidence of something the world often forgets, that knowledge didn't always come from the West, that the desert once held a light as bright as any city. And now he was holding the flame. It didn't happen all at once. Danger rarely does. At first, it was just a rumor that something was shifting in the north, that a group was moving, fast, angry, armed. Abdel listened. He paid attention, but he didn't panic, because the manuscripts had survived worse. Floods, fire, centuries of neglect, dust storms that swallowed entire villages. And yet, they were still here, tucked in drawers, folded under beds, wrapped in cloth, passed from grandfather to grandson. They had never needed saving until now. By early 2012, something changed. Militants were closing in, on Timbuktu, not just with weapons, but with an ideology that feared knowledge. They began burning music, shuttering schools, erasing names from plaques, and then they turned to the libraries. Abdel knew he didn't have time. He didn't call the government. He didn't go to the media. He did what the manuscripts had always taught him to do. He thought. He planned, quietly, and he began with one book. It was a manuscript on astronomy, roughly 600 years old, handwritten by a scholar whose name had been nearly forgotten, but whose diagrams of the moon still whispered truth. He wrapped it in cloth, carefully, like tucking in a child, then placed it in a metal trunk. Not a safe, just a trunk. Worn, used, unremarkable, and he carried it down the alley. The streets were nearly empty. Dust rose as he walked. He didn't look over his shoulder, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he knew if he started looking back, he might never stop. That first book was brought to a trusted home across town, hidden beneath a pile of rice sacks in a storeroom. No guards, no lock, just trust and silence. The next night he moved another, then 5, then 10. He told no one outside his circle, no speeches, no social posts, just movement. He and a few others began building a network. Nephews, friends, neighbors, all sworn to secrecy. They worked at night, by candlelight. They used donkeys, canoes, old motorbikes with squeaky wheels. Some books were moved in plastic bags, others in baskets meant for dates or grain. They weren't smuggling contraband. They were smuggling memory. He didn't sleep much, not because of fear, but because every moment the book stayed in Timbuktu was a moment they might be lost. One night he almost got caught. A cart had broken down just outside the city wall, too far to turn back, too far to explain. And in that moment, as headlights approached, Abdel climbed inside the pile of bags and simply stopped breathing. The men passed by, didn't stop, didn't question, and the books made it through. He would later say, "We didn't fight them, we outlasted them." By the end of the operation, over 350,000 manuscripts had been moved, some over 600 miles, some by boat, many through checkpoints manned by men with guns, and yet not one book was lost. He didn't take credit. He said he was only doing what needed to be done. But he knew, had he waited, the fire would have come, and centuries would have turned to ash in minutes. So he moved them, one trunk at a time, until the old rooms were empty and the library silent, but safe. Sometimes, he said, when the wind blew just right, you could still hear the pages turning. Saving the books wasn't something Abdel could do alone. And he knew it, not because he was weak, but because memory has always been a shared burden. So he built a network, not of officials, not of soldiers, but of people like him, quiet, careful, and invisible in all the right ways. Some were family, some were childhood friends, some were people who just understood. They didn't ask for money, they didn't ask for permission, they just listened. And when Abdul told them what he planned, they nodded and said yes. They became the caretakers of a whisper. One man had a bakery. By day, he made bread. By night, he moved trunks of manuscripts beneath bags of flour. Another was a teacher. She hid a dozen books in her classroom beneath the floorboards. The books never stayed in one place too long. Movement was safety, so the team rotated them, city to village, back to city, room to cellar, cellar to basket, basket to boat. They used old trade routes once meant for salt and gold. Now they carried pages, and in the silence of the desert, each book seemed heavier than its weight. Abdul gave the operation a name privately. He called it the Flame, because to him, that's what the manuscripts were. Not relics, not antiques, but light. And the desert wind was always ready to blow it out. Each person in the network carried that flame for a while, and then passed it on. No announcements, no recognition, just trust. It wasn't just a logistical challenge. It was emotional, heavy. Some of the people were terrified. They knew what would happen if they were caught. Some had families, children who didn't understand why their parents stayed up at night, whispering near dusty trunks. Abdel never told them they had to do it. He simply told them the truth. If we don't protect these books, he said, no one will know we ever existed. And that was enough. Some manuscripts were centuries old. Others were newer, written by scholars whose names only lived in these pages. Each book was a voice, and without the network, those voices would go silent. In time, the books reached Bamako, the capital, safer, but not truly safe. They were stored in ordinary homes, stacked in storerooms beside sacks of millet, tucked behind curtains. Some were wrapped in aluminum foil, because that's what was available. The people who hid them often didn't read Arabic. They didn't need to. They understood something deeper than language, that some things are sacred simply because they're old and still here. Abdel didn't sleep. He made lists. He checked locations. He moved from town to town, pretending to visit relatives, when in truth, he was checking the flame. And the flame kept flickering. One woman later said, "It wasn't the danger that scared me. It was the silence." Because none of them could talk about it. Not even to neighbors, not even to their children. For 2 years, they carried the weight of secrets, the burden of memory. And somehow, through drought, checkpoints, betrayal, and fear, the flame survived. There were no ceremonies, no medals. Abdel said, "You don't get a prize for remembering." But maybe, just maybe, the prize was this: that somewhere, in a small room in Bamako, A child will one day open a dusty trunk and read words written 800 years ago and know that someone, many someones, risked everything to make sure she could. The books were safe, but what was inside them was what mattered most. When people think of ancient manuscripts, they imagine dusty tomes of religious text, or perhaps philosophical riddles. And yes, there were those, but there was so much more. Some manuscripts were family records, handwritten notes about births, marriages, arguments over land. Others detailed trade deals, caravans that moved salt, copper, and cloth across the Sahara. There were books on astronomy, with diagrams of constellations drawn by hand. Dist scholars charting stars not for wonder, but for direction, for survival. There were writings on medicine, cures made from roots and herbs, techniques for setting broken bones, treating fevers, easing childbirth. One manuscript spoke of how to avoid famine, another on how to resolve disputes without violence. These were not relics, they were handbooks for life. And what's more, they were African. They weren't imported from Europe. They weren't translations. They were written by West Africans in Timbuktu, Gao, and Janneh, in Arabic, in Songhai, in Tamashek. They revealed a civilization that had its own libraries, its own knowledge systems, its own way of seeing the world. And had Abdel not acted, we might have lost them. There's one manuscript that scholars always return to. It's a treatise on ethics written by a scholar named Ahmed Baba in the 1500s. He wrote, "You must not speak ill of those who differ from you." Imagine that. In an age when much of the world punished difference, here was a scholar, deep in the heart of Africa, writing about tolerance. Other manuscripts discussed education, not as a privilege, but as a duty. They suggested that knowledge was a path toward peace, and that scholarship was not for pride, but for humility. Abdul once said, "These books show we had a history before colonialism, a mind before we were told how to think, a voice before anyone tried to silence it." And when extremists threatened that voice, he didn't fight them with guns. He fought them with paper, with silence, with movement, with memory. Years later, scholars from around the world would visit the hidden libraries in Bamako. They'd hold the fragile pages. They'd trace the ink with gloved hands. And they'd say the same thing. We had no idea this existed. But it did. It always did. Sometimes it just takes someone to remember it before the world forgets. One of Abdul's favorite stories was about a manuscript that had been hidden in a ceiling, wrapped in sheepskin, tied with an old shoelace, forgotten during the chaos. When they opened it years later, they found a prayer. It read, "May these words live beyond my life. May they find the hands of someone who needs them." And they had. That prayer had traveled across time, across war, across fear, and landed exactly where it was needed. In your ears tonight. That is what was almost lost. And that is what was saved. You're still here. Thank you for listening. The desert is quiet now. The wind has slowed, and the books, they're resting too. Somewhere in Bamako, in a quiet room filled with the smell of old paper and wood, they wait. Not in museums, not behind glass, but on shelves, in trunks, in hands. Abdelkader Haidara still watches over them, older now, quieter, but still walking the same streets, still protecting the same words. Sometimes he's asked why he did it, why risk so much for a pile of old pages? And he says, because the past belongs to everyone. If we lose it, we lose our way. There are still wars, still people who burn books, still fires trying to consume the past. But there are also people like Abdel and like you who choose to remember. You didn't need to be here, but you stayed. You chose this story. You chose to carry the memory with you. And now, in a way that matters more than you know, you are part of it too. So rest now. Let the story settle. Let the night hold you for a while. And when you wake, remember the man who moved a library across deserts, through silence, with care. Remember the flame. Good night.